our next reader is Mark Wolverton. He's got a web-exclusive story called One Potato, Two Potato, and he's going to read a little bit for us today. Mark is a science writer for magazines like Air and Space, Smithsonian, Popular Science. He's a playwright whose work's been produced in Philadelphia, LA, Chicago, and elsewhere. And an author whose latest book is A Life in Twilight, The Final Years of J. Robert Oppenheimer from St. Martin's Press. He lives in Bryn Mawr. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you. I must admit that when I submitted the story to Christine and Carl, I was kind of uncertain they were going to take it because it's kind of a quirky little science fiction story, which I don't usually see in Philadelphia stories. But they did, and here we are. One potato, two potato. Ackerman traced the fiber optic cable leading from the control unit under the customized sofa lounger to the I/O port in the side of Mrs. Frimmel's skull. The coldness of the metal connection surrounded by soft hair and warm skin always felt weird to him, but Ackerman had become used to it by now, more or less. The filaments of the cable pulsed with faint-colored light as the unit monitored and decoded her cerebral activity. The connections were okay, which annoyed Ackerman. Usually with this kind of glitch, it was only a bad cable or damaged data port, either of which could be fixed in just a few minutes. Mr. Frimmel sat next to his wife, quiet and still, like a good potato. They were a neat and pleasant middle-aged couple, and obviously had money, judging by their fancy house. Ackerman never knew what made people like this volunteer to be jacked in. It wasn't like they needed the compensation, 10 grand and deep discounts on the products of the Omnifax agency's client corporations. But he was there to fix a bad data feed, not make sociological observations. He squatted down to check the screen on the control unit. Frimmel, Marianne A. Transfer rate average 420 terabytes a minute, 67% below nominal. Harmonic interference 2 times 10 to the 5th. Well, so much for his lunch hour. After setting up the test rig, he stole a minute to take in the show on the flat-screen TV that filled the entire wall opposite the sofa. It was the only source of illumination in the room. Goddamn commercials, Ackerman thought as he keyed in a test program. That's all the potatoes watched, 24/7, for weeks or even months on end. Drugs and neural stimulation slowed down their normal physical functions, while the Omnifax maintenance techs came in every day or two to see to other necessities. All the while, the subject's brain responses to various stimuli were tested, evaluated, and recorded, and the data collated and analyzed. All to make better and more effective commercials. Mrs. Frimmel began losing the blank and contented facial expression of a good potato. She trembled, her neck and facial muscles twitched. Perspiration formed on her forehead. Ackerman started the next diagnostic, hoping that her shakiness was just a usual post-installation reaction. But the records on the Frimmels showed that they'd been jacked in for about 3 weeks already. She should have settled down by now. Not good, Ackerman muttered to himself, as Mrs. Frimmel's movements increased in intensity. A trail of spittle dribbled from the corner of her mouth, her expression pained, eyes squeezed shut. Beside her, Mr. Frimmel continued to soak up input, blissfully oblivious. And everything was coming up green in the diagnostics. It didn't make sense. Nothing was wrong with the equipment, otherwise Mr. Frimmel would be displaying the same reactions. Which meant that Mrs. Frimmel had to be fresh, clean, and free of embarrassing odors, somebody shouted in Ackerman's ear. Why should you suffer from... He was startled for a second until he realized the voice was booming from the TV. Probably a stray voltage spike somewhere in the line kicking up the volume. Ackerman scuttled crab-like across the floor to the flat screen and fumbled for the hidden panel along the bottom, then jabbed his thumb on the Restore Settings button. The ad spot mercifully returned to its low murmur. He leaned against the wall and glanced over at the Frimmels. At least Mrs. Frimmel seemed to be calming down. For a minute there, he thought she was... son of a bitch. Her lips were moving, and potatoes weren't supposed to talk. On hands and knees, Ackerman crawled back beside the Frimmels' sofa. Embarrassing odors, said Mrs. Frimmel in a low monotone. Embarrassing odors. Free from. Why suffer? She was quoting the goddamn commercial. Ackerman got up on his knees and leaned on the arm of the sofa. Mrs. Frimmel was still shaking and sweating. Quirtle, she shouted. Quirtle, odors. Knowing it was useless, Ackerman began checking everything again. Connections, interface, power supply. Nothing. Cordal, Mrs. Frimmel repeated. Better. Better? Wait a minute. Ackerman punched up the reception records for the Frimmel's connection node. A listing scrolled up on the control unit screen, lines of cryptic words and numbers in digital hash. Records of everything over their feed for the last 24 hours. Every single ad spot or infomercial or whatever the hell they saw on that screen had its own ID flag, with the time it was transmitted, its length, and the name of the company for which Omnifax made the ad. Ackerman hit a key on the control unit keyboard, halting the scrolling lines, then backed up a bit. Portal, Mrs. Frimmel proclaimed. Ackerman tapped his finger on the screen, nodding in triumph. One of the data lines read, 45934 BIFODA data TRF /:42/fleet // bracket HT 38632. Quirtle, he said softly. Quirtle, Mrs. Frimmel echoed. He glanced back at the screen and turned up the volume. The elaborate computer animation was transforming a depressed-looking couple into new people, remaking their faces, their bodies. Here at Quirtle, we're pioneering the next wave in custom engineering, said a cheerful voiceover. Quirtle is in the forefront of exciting new genetic technologies that can correct almost any flaw in your body, your health, your appearance, and that of your children and children-to-be. Any flaw, Mrs. Frimmel explained. Children-to-be, Quirtle. Quirtle, said the voiceover, where DNA is only a suggestion. And don't forget our line of personal hygiene products. The Quirtle ad ended and a new commercial promptly took its place. Ackerman turned to watch Mrs. Frimmel. She was calm and quiescent again, her mouth no longer moving, body no longer trembling. Ackerman muted the sound and glanced at the screen. Different ad, different company, as he'd expected. He hit the COM button on the test gear panel. The screen flickered and the tech dispatcher's annoyed face appeared. You're interrupting my lunch, Ackerman, he said. We got a tater treat here, McAfee. Totally fried, it looks like. Selective stimulatory fixation. Oh shit, McAfee groaned. That's the third SSF this month. You sure? I'm not a goddamn amateur. You're on the Frimmels, right? Which one's the tater? The wife, answering, glanced over at Mr. Frimmel. Husband looks okay, no crosstalk between them. Good, then maybe we can still salvage something. McAfee looked down as if checking a note. What's she hung on? Quirtel Biotech. I did a download trace, and every time a Quirtel ad comes up, her biosigns go snarky. Plus, I saw it happen to myself just a minute ago when a Quirtel spot came over the feed. Quirtel, Mrs. Frimmel yelled. McAfee frowned. What was that? That was her, Ackerman said, checking the TV. It's not one of their spots coming over now, so she must have responded just hearing me saying the name. Auditory response too, McAfee said, shaking his head. Yeah, said Ackerman. You better tell Quirtel that whatever new mindfuck's in their ads, it's serious hoodoo. That's the point, McAfee snapped. Grab them by the balls. Bypass the filters of the conscious mind. Save me the company's sales pitch, McAfee. It's one thing to grab people by the balls, but you've got to give them a chance to think, too. We want them to think about buying the product. We're fucking with people's heads. Nothing new about that. We're just doing it more directly. The future of advertising. Ackerman shook his head. It wasn't like this before Omnifax bought out the agency. Spare me the crap about the good old days, huh? McAfee scowled at him. I shouldn't tell you this, Harry, but some of the bosses think you've developed a bad attitude about the work. Ackerman shrugged. Sometimes I think about the big picture, so what? Your job is the little picture, maintaining the data feeds. McAfee paused. We're pioneers in this field, you know. You should try to be more excited. Yeah, when I can retire in 7 more years, then I'll be excited as hell. McAfee finally gave up. Okay, Ackerman, we'll get a crew out there ASAP. He glanced down at his notes again. I think we've got another subject we can plug in with Mr. Frimmel. Same demographic and probably a better match for him anyway. Another subject, said Ackerman. I don't think that... You better stay there just in case she spazzes out, McAfee interrupted. We don't want her to get hurt if she's still recoverable. Recoverable, Ackerman thought. Right, fill her full of drugs and number her with synaptic therapy, and if that doesn't work, Quirtle puts her up in a home somewhere. Probably be a couple of hours, McAfee continued. Get comfy, crack a beer or something. Bite me, Ackerman snapped, closing the line.